Imagine coming home one day and realizing the road that's been part of your land for decades is suddenly gone. My name's Daniel Cooper, and I own a 50-acre ranch on the edge of a quiet little town. For years, a dusty gravel road cut through my property. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. I drove my tractor down it, my cattle crossed it, and it worked just fine. A while back, the president of the neighboring HOA begged me to let their residents use it as a shortcut to the highway. It saved them 5 minutes on their commute. I agreed on a handshake, no contracts. No money, just being neighborly, but after a 3-day trip, I came back to something that made my blood boil. My simple gravel road wasn't there anymore. In its place was a shiny strip of black asphalt, lined with painted curbs, decorative lampposts, and manicured landscaping. It looked like the grand entrance to their neighborhood, except it was still on my land, and the cherry on top, a smug little note taped to my gate. In accordance with community beautification standards, this road has been upgraded for the benefit of all residents. When people talk about living in the country, they picture something quiet, peaceful, and steady. And they're right. Out here, life moves at its own pace. The wind carries the smell of grass and earth. The sun sets without a skyline of concrete to block it, and the only traffic you'll hear is the low rumble of a tractor or the steady clip-clop of cattle moving across a pasture. For me, that life isn't a vacation fantasy or a weekend getaway. It's what I've known since I was a kid. My name's Daniel Cooper, and I own 50 acres of ranch land. My family has worked this land for generations. My father raised cattle here, my grandfather before him, and I've kept that tradition alive. The land isn't just soil and grass to me, it's memory, history, and livelihood all wrapped together. And cutting straight through that land is a road. A simple, dusty gravel road. It's not fancy, never was. But it's ours. That road carried more than just trucks and tractors. It carried memories. I learned to drive on it when I was 12, grinding the clutch on my dad's old Chevy pickup. I used to ride horses along its edge, racing the summer storms rolling in from the west. Every spring I'd spread fresh gravel where the ruts got deep, just enough to keep it usable. It wasn't perfect, but it belonged to me now. A few years back, the world around my ranch started to change. What used to be nothing but open prairie and scattered farmhouses slowly transformed into rows of cookie-cutter houses, the kind that all looked the same except for the color of the siding. A developer bought up land on the edge of town, threw up an entire neighborhood in less than 2 years, and crowned it with something I'd never dealt with before, an HOA. If you've never lived near an HOA, let me paint you a picture. Manicured lawns cut to exactly 2 inches. Mailboxes painted the same shade of beige. Cars parked only in designated spots. And a board of residents who believe their little patch of suburbia is the center of the universe. That's what moved in next to me. On one side, I had dust, cattle, and hayfields. On the other side, I had pastel houses, white picket fences, and imported palm trees that looked ridiculous in this part of the country. One summer afternoon, maybe 3 years ago, I got a knock on my door. When I opened it, there stood Richard Harris, the self-declared president of the HOA. Richard was the kind of guy who never looked comfortable unless he was giving orders. His smile was tight, his shirt perfectly pressed, and he had the kind of handshake that was more about dominance than greeting. He explained, in that slick voice of his, that the residents of his community had discovered something. They realized my gravel road saved them about 5 minutes on their drive to the highway. 5 minutes. To me, that wasn't much. Out here, 5 minutes is nothing. But to them, that shortcut was gold. Richard asked if I'd be willing to let the residents use my road. He called it a win-win for the community. I wasn't impressed with his pitch, but I thought about it. The truth is, I don't mind being a good neighbor. I've helped pull cars out of ditches, lent tools to folks passing through, and shared hay with struggling ranchers. Letting some suburbanites shave a few minutes off their commute didn't seem like the end of the world. So I agreed. No money, no paperwork, just a handshake deal between me and Richard for the next couple of years. The traffic came. Minivans, shiny SUVs, and sedans that had probably never seen a dirt road in their lives. They all rattled across my gravel. Some of the drivers waved when they saw me. Some pretended I didn't exist. I didn't care much either way. They were using the road because I allowed them to. End of story, but the thing about favors is, people get used to them. Pretty soon they stop seeing it as generosity and start seeing it as something they're entitled to. And that's exactly what happened here earlier this year. I had to head out of town for a livestock expo. Nothing unusual about that. Ranching is a business, and these expos are where deals get made. I left the ranch in good shape, with cattle tended, fences secure, and the road exactly as it had always been, dusty, bumpy, but reliable. 3 days later, I came home, and for a moment, I thought I'd taken a wrong turn as I drove up to where the gravel road should have been. I saw something so out of place it stopped me in my tracks. My road, the road I'd driven all my life, was gone. In its place was a glossy strip of black asphalt, freshly laid, still reeking of tar. White painted curbs framed it on either side. Decorative lamp posts, the kind you'd see in a fancy subdivision, stood in neat rows, and along the edges they'd planted ornamental shrubs and flowers. Like this was some grand boulevard leading into their neighborhood. I sat there in my truck, staring at it, my jaw hanging open. It wasn't just a road anymore. It was a statement. They'd taken my land, my property, and turned it into their own personal showcase. And the worst part? They never asked. Not a call. Not a knock on the door. Not even a heads up. I parked, climbed out of the truck, and walked up to my gate. That's when I saw it, a single sheet of paper, taped right to the metal. The wind fluttered it against the frame, and when I pulled it free, I almost laughed at the arrogance in accordance with community beautification standards. This road has been upgraded for the benefit of all residents, the benefit of all residents. Like I was one of them, like my ranch was part of their HOA kingdom. Let me tell you something, my land isn't under their jurisdiction. It never was. And reading that note, something deep inside me turned cold. This wasn't just about paving a road. This was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. They had trespassed, destroyed my property, and then acted like I should be grateful. As if they were doing me a favor by dragging their suburban standards onto my ranch. I stood there for a long while, staring at that shiny asphalt cutting across my land, and I felt a slow burn building in my chest. They thought they could roll over me, smooth me out like one of their curbs. But they had no idea who they were dealing with, because that road might look different now, but it was still mine. And I was about to remind them of that fact in a way they'd never forget. Residents, I wasn't one of them. This wasn't their road, and they were about to learn that the hard way. I stood there staring at that blacktop, and the longer I looked at it, the angrier I got. You've got to understand something. Country folks like me, we don't expect much from the world. Give us good land, good weather, and enough feed for the animals, and we're content. But what we do expect, what we demand, is respect. And this wasn't respect. This was arrogance, plain and simple. I kept replaying the sequence in my head. How many people had to be involved in this? How many trucks rolled in while I was gone, dumping asphalt, setting curbs, and planting those ridiculous shrubs? This wasn't an overnight job. It must have taken a small army, and not one of them thought to call me. Not one worker, not one HOA board member, not even Richard Harris, the man who'd once shaken my hand and promised me their community would be respectful neighbors. And now, here I was, standing on my own land, staring at a road I didn't ask for, a road that screamed someone else's authority. It wasn't just pavement, it was a power play. They were telling me in no uncertain terms, we can do what we want, but they didn't realize one thing. They might have paved it, they might have planted their little flowers and put up their lamps, but legally this ground was mine. And if there's one thing you don't mess with, it's a man's land. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept pacing the house, replaying the note in my mind, in accordance with community beautification standards. The words practically dripped with smugness. Beautification? To me, beauty was watching the sun rise over the pasture, not a row of imported tulips wilting in the wrong climate. The more I thought, the clearer my path became. They wanted to play games. Fine, I'd play. But I wasn't going to yell or curse or throw a tantrum. No, when you're dealing with people like this, the best revenge is patience and precision. I went out to my equipment shed, and there it was, a heavy-duty cattle gate I hadn't used in years. Solid steel, 10 feet tall, built to withstand bulls that didn't take kindly to boundaries. I brushed the dust off, ran my hand along the cold metal, and smiled. It was perfect. I backed my tractor up, hooked onto that gate, and by midnight I had it bolted across the shiny new asphalt. Locked tight, reinforced, immovable. Where their shortcut used to flow freely, now there was nothing but a wall of steel and a heavy chain, and let me tell you, the satisfaction I felt in that moment, I can't even put it into words. For the first time since I'd pulled into my driveway, I felt like I'd taken back control. The next morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch, waiting. I didn't have to wait long. By 7:15, the parade of cars started. Minivans, BMWs, shiny Lexuses lined up at the gate like cattle at a pen. Horns honked, voices shouted, and I just sipped my coffee, letting the chaos unfold. One man got out of his car, marched up to the gate, and shook it like he thought it would just pop open. It didn't budge an inch. Another lady rolled down her window and started yelling about being late for work. I tipped my hat and went back inside within hours. My phone started blowing up. First it was the, secretary, then Richard Harris himself, then some lawyer I'd never heard of. All of them were demanding, threatening, and insisting that I open the road. I gave them the same answer every time. It's my land. You altered it without permission. If you don't like it, take the long way around. See, that's the thing. I wasn't being unreasonable. They trespassed, they paved over my property, and now they were dealing with the consequences. But something told me this fight was only just beginning, because people like that, they don't back down easy. And I was more than ready to push back harder. By sunrise that first morning, the shortcut they loved so much was gone, sealed shut with steel and a heavy chain. And by mid-morning, the HOA was in full panic mode. I'd barely finished my coffee when my phone started buzzing. The first call came from the HOA secretary, a nervous-sounding woman who spoke so quickly I could hardly understand her. She demanded that I unlock the gate immediately. I told her calmly, "Ma'am, this is my property. That road has always been private. Your HOA had no right to pave it, and now it's closed." She sputtered something about community rights before hanging up on me. An hour later, Richard Harris himself called. His tone was different. Gone was the neighborly salesman voice. This was sharp, clipped, and full of entitlement. "Daniel," he snapped, "you're blocking a public roadway." "That's illegal." I couldn't help but laugh. "Public? Richard, you and I both know this road has never been public. You begged me years ago to let your people use it, remember? On a handshake. Not a contract. Not a deed transfer. A handshake. And now you've paved over my land without permission." Richard tried to spin it. He said the community had invested in the road, that it was for the benefit of all residents, and that I should be grateful for them destroying my property. I told him flat out, "If you or your people try to tamper with my gate, I'll have the sheriff out here so fast it'll make your head spin," and I hung up. By the afternoon I had visitors. A convoy of 3 SUVs pulled up, and out stepped Richard himself, flanked by 2 other HOA board members. And then there was Linda McCarthy, vice president of the HOA. Picture a woman in pearls, heels sinking into gravel, carrying herself like she owned the world. She looked me up and down like I was a farmhand trespassing on her estate. "Mr. Cooper," she said in a clipped tone, "you are in violation of community codes. This road is now part of our neighborhood infrastructure." I didn't even try to hide my smile. "Ma'am," I said, holding up my property deed, "this here says otherwise. This road has been on my family's land for decades. You don't own an inch of it." Linda's face tightened. Richard tried to intervene, throwing out threats about lawsuits, easements, and public access, but I was ready. I had copies of my land survey, stamped and signed by the county. The road ran right through my acreage. Always had, always would. There was no easement filed, no right-of-way granted, nothing. Their infrastructure was built on my private property, plain and simple. "You people trespassed," I told them. "You altered my land without consent. And now you're trespassing again. If you don't leave, I'll be calling the sheriff right now." They left, but not before Linda hissed, "You'll regret this now." When someone tells me I'll regret standing up for my rights, it doesn't scare me. It motivates me. That night I got to work. I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office for property destruction. I also contacted a lawyer I knew from town, a sharp guy who'd handled land disputes before. Together, we drafted a civil suit for unauthorized alterations and trespassing. But I wasn't done. I had something the HOA didn't expect: drone footage. See, a month earlier, I'd been testing out a new drone I bought for fun. I'd flown it around the property, getting shots of the gravel road in its original condition. And wouldn't you know it, the week before I left for the expo, I'd captured footage of the same stretch of land still untouched gravel. Now, with the fresh asphalt down, I had proof, before and after. Clear as day, I sent the footage, along with the story, to the local news station. They loved this kind of drama, small-town rancher versus overreaching HOA. By the next evening, the story was on the 6 o'clock news. HOA paves over rancher's private road without permission. They even interviewed a couple of my neighbors, who were more than happy to side with me. The fallout was immediate. HOA residents were furious, not at me, but at their own board. Overnight, their beloved 5-minute shortcut had become a 20-minute detour. They were sitting in traffic, wasting gas, and the target of their anger was squarely on Richard and Linda. My phone didn't stop ringing, not with threats anymore, but with apologies. Residents who'd once ignored me on the road were now begging me to open the gate. But here's the thing. I wasn't about to let them off easy within days. Richard and Linda came crawling back, this time with their lawyer in tow. They tried to negotiate. First, they offered to restore the gravel road and cover damages. I declined. Then they offered a lump sum, $25,000, to make the issue go away. I declined again. Money wasn't the point. Respect was. Finally. In a closed-door meeting at my lawyer's office, I laid out my terms. They could keep their pretty boulevard, their lampposts, and their landscaping on one condition. They signed a legally binding rental agreement. For the privilege of using my land, they would pay me $4,000 a month. If they missed even a single payment, the gate stayed locked. Period. You should have seen their faces. Richard went pale. Linda nearly choked on her outrage. Their lawyer tried to argue, but the truth was simple. They had no case. They had trespassed, altered private property, and embarrassed themselves publicly. I held all the cards. By the end of the week. The contract was signed. The HOA residents got their shortcut back, but it came at a price. Every month, like clockwork, they now send me a check. And every month I drive past their manicured boulevard on my tractor, tip my hat, and smile. What they thought would be a free upgrade turned into the most expensive shortcut in the county. And that's a lesson they won't forget anytime soon. If you think the HOA accepted defeat gracefully, you'd be wrong. Signing that rental agreement didn't kill their pride, it only made them angrier. And like a wounded animal, they lashed out. At first, it was little things. HOA residents drove by my ranch slower than usual, glaring at me through their tinted windows. Flyers started showing up in my mailbox anonymous, of course accusing me of being a greedy landowner who was extorting hardworking families. One even said I was endangering children's lives by keeping the road locked during negotiations. The irony burned. They had stolen my land, and yet somehow I was the villain? Then came the real stunt. One Friday night, I woke up to the sound of grinding metal. I grabbed my flashlight and stormed out the door. And there they were, 3 men with bolt cutters, trying to snap the chain off my gate. HOA muscle. They froze when they saw me, but I didn't hesitate. I called the sheriff right in front of them. Within 30 minutes, red and blue lights lit up my driveway. The deputies weren't amused. They took statements, collected the cutters as evidence, and slapped the men with trespassing charges. The next morning, the story broke again in the local paper. HOA members arrested for attempting to break into rancher's property. My lawyer couldn't have scripted it better. But the HOA wasn't finished. Richard and Linda shifted tactics. They filed a lawsuit claiming that by closing the gate initially, I had interfered with essential community access. They argued that the road, once paved, had become a public utility and therefore no longer belonged exclusively to me. It was absurd, but lawsuits aren't about truth, they're about leverage. For weeks, the case dragged on. Court hearings, paperwork, back-and-forth arguments. The HOA hired a high-powered attorney from the city, a slick guy in designer suits who strutted into the courtroom like he owned the place. He painted me as a selfish rancher, A relic of the past who was standing in the way of progress. I'll admit, there were moments I felt cornered. The HOA had money, influence, and numbers. I was just one man with a patch of land and a stubborn streak. Some nights, lying awake, I wondered if I'd pushed too far. What if the judge sided with them? What if, after all this, I really did lose the road for good? But then I'd think of my grandfather. He'd cleared that land with his own hands, built fences, raised cattle, and carved out a living where no one else would. And I'd remember his words, "Land is the one thing they can't make more of." Protect it, Danny. Protect it like your life depends on it. So I doubled down. My lawyer and I brought every piece of evidence we had. The drone footage, the land surveys, the deed, even old county maps showing the road had always been private. We lined it up so neatly that when the judge looked over the files, his eyebrows shot up. The climax came on the third day of hearings. The HOA's attorney had just finished his speech about community needs when my lawyer rose and pressed play on the drone footage. The courtroom screens lit up, first the gravel road, quiet and untouched. Then, time-stamped just weeks later, the same stretch of land was paved over, fresh blacktop glistening in the sun. The contrast was undeniable. Ladies and gentlemen, my lawyer said, "This isn't progress. This is theft." The room went silent. Even Richard and Linda avoided eye contact. The judge leaned forward. His voice was calm but sharp as a blade. "Mr. Harris, Mrs. McCarthy, can you explain why your association paved private property without a recorded easement, written permission, or court approval?" Their attorney stammered. Richard shifted in his seat. Linda clenched her jaw. But there was no explanation. They had no paperwork, no consent, and no authority at that moment. Right there was the breaking point. The judge ruled in my favor. Not only did he affirm my ownership of the road, but he also ordered the HOA to pay damages for trespassing and property alteration. He even stated on record that my rental agreement was legally enforceable. The HOA had no choice but to honor it or lose access entirely. When the gavel fell, it was like the weight of the world slid off my shoulders. I'd stared down the HOA's wealth, influence, and arrogance, and I hadn't just survived, I'd won. But the best part wasn't the legal victory. It was the look on Richard's face as we walked out of that courtroom. Gone was the smug confidence, the condescension. He looked small, beaten. Linda didn't even lift her head. By evening, the news spread across town. Headlines read, "Rancher defeats HOA in court battle over road. The community that once doubted me now respected me." People who had glared at me weeks earlier waved as they drove by. Some even stopped to apologize for how the HOA had treated me that night. I stood at the gate, the same gate they had tried to cut open, and watched the sunset spill gold across the blacktop they thought they could steal. The road was still there, still paved, still lined with their fancy lights. But it was mine. Every inch of it. And now, every time an HOA resident drives down it, they're reminded of the day their leaders lost everything to a rancher who refused to be pushed around. After the gavel came down in my favor, life on the ranch felt different. Not because the land had changed, it was still the same dirt, the same cattle, the same wide-open skies, but because the air carried something new, respect. For the first time in months, I could walk down that paved stretch without feeling like an intruder on my own soil. My boots clicked against the asphalt, and instead of anger boiling in my chest, I felt calm. This was my road. Paved, polished, landscaped, and decorated, but mine. All the same, the HOA, of course, wasn't happy. They paid the damages, cut the checks for rent, and sulked like children forced to clean up their own mess. Every month, their treasurer mailed me a check for $4,000. Every month. I walked into the bank, deposited it with a smile, and thought about how their arrogance had turned into my profit. Heard whispers that Richard Harris nearly lost his position as HOA president. Some of the residents accused him of dragging them into the fiasco without proper votes or approvals. Linda, the pearl-wearing queen bee, stopped showing her face in public meetings altogether. The HOA board still existed, but their reputation? Shattered. And the residents, well, they changed too. The same folks who once honked their horns and shouted at me while stuck at the gate now gave a polite wave whenever they drove past. A few even stopped by the ranch to buy eggs or firewood, like they wanted to show they weren't all part of the problem. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was civility. And civility goes a long way out here, but let me tell you the sweetest part. That road they'd paved became the most expensive shortcut in the county. Not just because of the $4,000 a month, but because of everything it cost them in pride, legal fees, and reputation. People in town started calling it Cooper's Tollway. Some even joked that I should hang a sign that reads, "Welcome to Cooper Boulevard, paid for by the HOA." Didn't hang the sign, but I thought about it. Every time I passed the fancy lampposts that looked ridiculous against the backdrop of my cattle pastures, I thought about it sometimes at night. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch the headlights stream down the blacktop. Cars filled with residents who had once taken my kindness for granted were now literally paying for the privilege of driving across my land. And I'd think about how quickly things had turned I felt they were untouchable. They thought they could take without asking, decide without permission, and push without consequence. But they forgot one simple truth. Land isn't theirs until it's signed over. And mine never was. The sheriff told me later that the HOA had tried to lobby the county to take the road through eminent domain. But after the publicity from the case, no official wanted to touch it. Nobody wanted to be the politician who sided with an HOA against a rancher whose family had worked that land for generations. The public was firmly in my corner, and the HOA knew it. Funny thing is, I didn't need to destroy them. I didn't need to salt the earth or burn bridges. All I had to do was stand firm, stay patient, and let them hang themselves with their own arrogance. Months rolled by, and the checks kept coming. $4,000, then another, then another. That money paid for new fencing, fresh equipment, and even a few upgrades around the house. Every dollar felt like a reminder. They tried to steal from me. And now they're the ones footing the bill for my ranch's future, and yet the real reward wasn't financial. It was waking up every morning, walking down to that gate, and knowing I hadn't let anyone take what wasn't theirs. My grandfather's words echoed every time I saw the sun rise over the paved strip. Protect the land. Danny, protect it like your life depends on it. One evening, months after the dust settled, Richard himself drove up to the gate. He sat there for a while, engine idling, before finally stepping out. Gone was the sharp suit and smug expression. He looked tired, worn down. A man carrying more than just HOA politics on his shoulder. Shay never thought it would go this far, he admitted. His voice loudest. The thing about taking what doesn't belong to you, I told him. It always goes farther than you planned. He didn't argue. Didn't defend himself. Just nodded, climbed the back in his car, and drove away. I haven't seen him since, and that was the final nail, I think. Not the lawsuit, not the headlines, not even the monthly checks. It was the silence, the realization that he'd lost not just a battle, but his authority. Life went back to normal after that. The cattle still needed feeding, fences still needed mending, and seasons still rolled on like they always do. But in the back of my mind, I carried the lesson clear as day. Never let anyone, whether it's an HOA, a corporation, or a neighbor with too much pride, decide the worth of what's yours, because when you stand your ground, when you fight with patience and truth on your side, even the biggest bully can be brought to heel. So now, when I drive my tractor past that perfect little boulevard, I don't feel anger anymore. I feel satisfaction. Satisfaction that the land is still mine. Satisfaction that justice stood taller than arrogance. And satisfaction that, in the end, the HOAS improvement project turned into the biggest mistake they ever made. A mistake I'll be cashing checks for every single month, and that's how one stubborn rancher turned an HOAS arrogance into the most expensive shortcut in the county. But let me ask you this. If an HOA tried to pull a stunt like this on your property, what would you do? Would you fight them in court, lock the gates, or maybe cook up some revenge of your own? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one, and hey, if you enjoyed this showdown, you'll love our other unbelievable HOA dramas, especially story number 8. Trust me. You don't want to miss how that one turned out. Make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with a friend who hates HOAs as much as you do. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next wild story.